Committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 3372. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 3372 as amended to the House of Representatives, was previously passed by a voice vote in which a roll call vote was requested. Is a recorded vote still requested? Recorded vote is still requested. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson. No. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Aye. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Yay. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano. Mr. Massey.
Yes.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Aye. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Huffman. No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. Desanye. Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yakum.
Aye.
Mr. Yakum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer.
No.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Aye. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon. No. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Yes. Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Sykes.
Aye.
Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Yes. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton.
Aye.
Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Aye. Mr. Williams of New York votes aye. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
All members wish to be recorded
Oh, can I,
who haven't been?
how did I vote? Babin, right here. Am I recorded?
Mr. Babin is recorded as having voted aye.
No.
Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Ryan has not been recorded. Mr. Ryan votes no.
Anybody else wish to be recorded?
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no.
Okay, all right. I'll, Babin again, move me back to a yes.
Mr. Babin votes aye.
Can I ask the clerk what the recorded vote is? What the totals
No,
are?
you can't, no.
Can't?
Miss- Anyone else wish to be recorded?
Mr. Nels votes no.
Anyone else wish to be recorded? Clerk, please report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 33 ayes and 27 noes.
I voted 33 ayes, 27 noes. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.